Well, hello everybody. It's lovely to see you. My name's Clare, if you don't know me. I'm one of the pastors here. And we're carrying on in this series on building a culture of faith. And we've been talking about lots of different ways that we can understand how to build our faith and maybe push into a higher level of faith. I wonder how you're doing with that. Do you feel like something is engaged in you in this series as you've started to think, how can I grow a little bit? Well, one of the aspects of faith that we want to look at this evening is faith for being able to push in warfare. I mean, what does that even mean? What faith for warfare? What does that mean to a Christian? One of the things that I'm sure you're aware of today and this week is the sense, is there a power in charge, or is it all kind of a little bit uncertain? And sometimes in these turbulent times, we might be aware of the pressure of darkness as well, pushing in a little bit. And sometimes things seem to take a bit of a dark turn. And I think it's true to say that in our own personal lives as well, often in times of pressure and difficulty, we might ask those questions. Is there anyone in charge? Have I got any authority here? Can I do anything? And again, in those times, we might ask the question or be aware of that sense of the pressure of darkness in our personal lives. When we go through struggle or difficulty, it sometimes feels like there's more than just the surface things going on. There's some other dynamic. And I suppose this evening, as we look at faith for warfare, and we're going to look at David and Goliath, one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. In fact, Goliath is the most famous giant ever, apparently. It's the internet told me. He's number one on the list of famous giants. How amazing to have made it there. And archaeologists have dug around trying to find Goliath, and they haven't really found him, but they've found evidence of the civilizations that were the Philistine group of people that he was part of, and they found evidence possibly of a military settlement where the scene of our particular story this evening that might have taken place. It's interesting, really. Have a look at these two slides. Can you find those two a bit more? Go on. I'm rambling a bit. I'm not following my notes. If you go to the next slide. Okay, here you are. Look, this is what the sort of thing people do sometimes. This is there's some kind of dimensions of Goliath in the Bible that are mentioned. And somebody here has put a sort of this relative diagram here. And the littlest person there is supposed to be David. So David was a kind of man of his age. Apparently the average age of people in his time was about 5'6". So that was the kind of average height of men. And then the one in the middle there is the NBA All-Star Shaquille O'Neal as a guide. And then the top one there is what Goliath might have looked like. The next slide, if you go on, that's their feet. So David's got really little feet, and then there's all various. The one in the middle actually is Robert Wadlow. He's supposed to be the tallest man that ever lived in the Guinness Book of Records. Anyway, that's a complete aside. David and Goliath fascinate us, don't they? And the story fascinates us. Why does the story interest us, I wonder? Why is it so popular? Well, one thing I think it is because it's the story of a bully that gets taken out by a young lad, an ordinary person. And we love those stories, don't we? The bullies that get their comeuppance. But actually, I think that the story of David and Goliath give us a bit of a Scripture's perspective on power and the struggle for power and who finally overcomes in that struggle. And in fact, I actually believe that all the Bible stories and accounts are meant to show us something of the understanding of power dynamics on the earth, but also a bit of a hint behind the scenes as to how things go in the spiritual realm. I was listening to a teacher talking about it recently, and he said, I think we intellectually believe there is another realm, but I don't know if we really believe that the spiritual realm is affecting our daily lives. Do we really believe that there is a dynamic going on behind the scenes that affects us? Well, I do, and I think there's some great stuff to come out of this story that will help us understand how to navigate through our troubles and struggles as people who are meant to have power to overcome. I'm just going to read you something that, sorry, I got a little cough, that a friend wrote to me about a situation that had arisen at her work. And what she was finding was that a particular person in her workplace had sort of changed the dynamic of the workplace, and it had left her with some questions. So I'm just going to read you a little excerpt from her email. And she said this about his behavior. He was something of a bully and somebody who was actually trying to kind of manipulate a lot of people. And she said this: when I'm faced with that behavior, I feel intimidated. I can't think clearly. I find I'm in flight or fright mode. It's high stress and high emotion, but if I'm honest, it feels like there's something else going on here too. He is intelligent and he can see the effects of his behavior. He can regret them afterwards, but it doesn't stop him repeating them over and over again. Something in him seems to agree that he's got the right to behave like that. To be honest, it feels to me like it could destroy him, though, in the end. And then she goes on to say that she felt that unchecked, that behavior could pull the company apart, that weaknesses that were there before could somehow be stirred up, and that there were feelings of distrust and suspicion and people protecting themselves before they look out for others, and the family feel has gone. And she says, I think we can tackle it with some psychological understanding and behavior management, but I feel sure there's a spiritual dimension here too. Powerful forces of manipulation and control that are out to destroy something. And she asked the question, what does it mean for me at work to take on those forces and to, can I take them on? Oh, thanks. What does it mean for me to take that on in my workplace? And I think that is a very good question for us to ask ourselves. In the power plays on the earth and around us and in our lives, in times of struggle, in times of loss and difficulty, what can I do? How can I have faith to grow, to not lose hope, and sometimes to win against the powers of evil? The bullies, if you like, in the spiritual realm. How can I do that? So we're just going to dig a little bit into this story of David and Goliath. Okay, so we're going to read it now. And it's a long story in the Bible, so I've slightly abridged it, but we come into the story at the point where David, a shepherd boy, one of a number of brothers, who's looking after the sheep, and one day his father says to him, go and take some lunch to your brothers who are on the battlefield. So David, the shepherd boy, comes, and when he arrives, he finds this scene, this incredible scene of the two armies facing each other across the valley. And they've been at complete standpoint for 40 days because the Philistine army on one side have got this champion, this giant called Goliath, who's somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. And, excuse me, every day Goliath comes and taunts the people of Israel. And he taunts them and he says, bring out your best, come on. I'll tear you to shreds. Come on, bring them out. Whoever will come and take me on, I will fight them, and let's fight to the death. Whoever wins is going to be the victor here. Let's sort this out. And David arrives at this scene in the camp, and he hears Goliath taunting, and we'll pick it up there. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Saul is the king, so his army and the king are terrified. Carry on. So David goes up to King Saul. David, the shepherd boy, goes up to King Saul and says, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You're not able to go and fight against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David then explains to Saul, "When I was a shepherd boy, whenever a lion or a bear would come and attack, I would turn and fight them with my own bare hands." And he said, and he had won many a battle with bears and lions. And he says, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." So carrying on. So David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart. Your servant will go." Keep going forward. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." And David said to the Philistine, so he goes up into the place of where they're going to have the fight, and he shouts at Goliath, and he says this, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." So, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. David ran over and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. And that was the end of Goliath. It's a bit of a gory story, isn't it? But it is an amazing story. And one of the most striking things about it to me are the parallel lives of these two figures, David and King Saul. King Saul was the king of Israel. And when you first encounter Saul, what you hear is that he's a head and shoulders above everyone. So he's a tall man. He is taller than all of his peers, and he ends up getting anointed as king of Israel. But what you see in the figure of King Saul is a deeply erratic, jealous, angry person who is insecure at every turn. In fact, the first time he appears in the Bible, he's hiding amongst the baggage. That's where they get him from, to anoint him as king. And Saul has got this history of insecurity and jealousy and fear. And on this day, he finds himself on the battle line, and he is living out a continuation of the pattern of his life. And in possibly the greatest challenge, the greatest fight of his life, here is Saul totally paralyzed by fear. And one of the realities in spiritual warfare, understanding warfare, is that the eyes of faith are the only ones that are going to be able to see where the resources are. Only one person could see where the resources were, and everybody else was terrified, because it's only the eyes of faith that can see where resources are. King Saul, he's given way to fear, and he's full of fear in his life. And fear has this amazing effect on human beings. It paralyzes us. It actually affects our brains so that our brains become less flexible. We're less able to think. When we're stuck in a place of fear, we're less likely to make good, rational decisions, and we're more likely to be reactive and strike out or do irrational things. So fear isn't good for human beings, and it magnifies the trouble around us and makes us unable to find solutions. Fear magnifies, but faith brings perspective. And one of the things that we need to grow in, if we want to be people who grow in faith, particularly to fight battles against the powers of evil in this world, is we need to grow in faith so that we can see where the resources are in the moment of pressure. And we need to become practiced at trusting and having faith and seeing what God has given us. Jesus, in John's Gospel, he describes the thief that comes in to steal. He says that he's the good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd, he says. I'll lay down my life for the sheep. That's a courageous thing that he's willing to do. But he says there is a thief who comes to steal and kill and destroy. And actually, there's a spiritual power in this world. The Bible is very clear that is out to steal from us and to rob us of peace and freedom and all the inheritance that God has given us. And fear is one of the main inroads that spirit gets to us. I can remember this little moment when I was with one of my children at the dentist, and he was about 5, and he just got completely terrified of the dentist. So when he got in to sit down on the dentist chair, the dentist chair started to recline as it does, and he just got completely overcome by fear. And he got up and he ran out of the dentist's surgery, and he ran down the corridor, and went out through the kitchen at the back of the dentist and into the back garden of the dentist before I could even say anything. And I found myself running out behind him. It was a bit of a ridiculous scene. And there I was in the back garden of the dentist with one of my children who was about to get a profound fear of dentists locked into him, and I wasn't having any of it. And I can just remember in this moment, an absolute moment of clarity, thinking, fear wants to take hold in my child's life, and I'm not having it. And I kneeled down and I eyeballed him. And I said, fear is a thief, and he wants to steal from you. And every time you let him steal, it'll get bigger. You don't have to give way to fear. What are you going to do about this? He was only 5, bless him. But I saw him sort of swallow and suppress his fear and basically walk back in. And he got on that dentist chair and it reclined and he did it. And actually that fear never came again. But you know what? In my time as somebody who's done prayer ministry and done counselling for years and years and years, I have seen over and over again the effect of people who have found that situations and circumstances have overwhelmed them with fear, and it's begun something that has grown and grown and grown in their lives, and suddenly they find years down the line sometimes that fear is a constant resident in their life. And fear always battles with faith, or faith always battles with fear. The two things are kind of mutually exclusive. And in this moment, Saul is consumed with fear, and he can't even see that he's probably the same height as Goliath. He can't see his own resources. He can't see his army. He can't see what is possible. Now, we know it is possible because a moment or two later, actually the battle is won by this boy who comes onto the scene, David. And David sees the same scene before him. Stretching out before him the same army, the same aggressive Philistine army, the same giant, the same 40 days that has totally defeated them. But he comes in and he has this incredible demeanor in the story, doesn't he? As a boy, or a young man. From the word go, first of all, if you read the whole story, he's just checking out the situation. He's asking people what is going on, what has been going on. He seems to have this sort of quiet authority. And then he comes in and you see this scene unfolding where he just takes charge. And he knows what he's about and he feels sure of himself. And what he does is he dips into his own history and he reassures himself and he reassures the people around him. I've been here. I've been in danger before. And I have known the presence of God in danger. And because I know that he is with me, I can say to you today that he is with me today. And that's one of those principles that are precious to Christians. And it is this, that your history with God, the times where you have faced a battle or two and you've overcome in some area of life, will stand you in good stead for the future, for the present, where you can win this battle. And I just want to say to you today that if you're in a battle today, whatever it is, whether it's an emotional battle because something has gone on in your life that has hurt you or harmed you, if you're in a battle, then you can win. And if you're in a battle in your workplace and you feel the pressure of darkness in your workplace, or you feel alone perhaps, there's no other Christians, then I'm saying to you today that you can win with faith, because faith will show you your resources and they will be there, because God has promised to be with you every day. Jesus promised to be with us every day to the end of the age. And actually, where you have won in the past, you gain authority. You gain authority so that you can come in like King David, like David did on that day, with a sense of authority and ease. And I believe actually that we're called to live lives not of ease, but to be at ease in our lives, even in times of pressure. To be like Jesus, who in the middle of a storm could fall asleep because he was at ease, and then wake up, and with that same ease and authority, bring peace to the storm. That's how we win. That's how faith helps us win. So faith sees where the resources are. Faith understands too the nature of the battle, and this is something that we sometimes shy away a little bit from, understanding the nature of our enemy. What is the enemy here? Who is Goliath? Well, in one sense, he's a human being who has been consumed with hatred. He's a broken man. And in the end, his own brokenness, his taunting, gets him killed. But it's interesting to see what he does. First of all, he specializes in intimidation. Goliath just taunts and shouts and drowns out every other voice with this intimidation and taunting. And we find that, in spiritual battles. We find that in our lives sometimes, that at times of most pressure, the voices of intimidation, you're never going to manage to do this. You're too weak. Life is not going to be that good for you. Everybody else is going to get what you need. Or in places of pressure, in places of darkness, this is too dark. The world cannot be sorted out. This situation can't be sorted out. Intimidation and the enemy. The Bible teaches us that the enemy of our souls specializes in intimidation. He wants to induce fear in us, and he's good at it. Peter, in his epistle, says, be aware that, be sober-minded, he says, and alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. He's speaking there in the context of teaching them about anxiety. He's saying, cast all your cares on God. He cares for you. But be aware. The enemy is prowling around, wanting to devour you. In times of pressure, that's where we find him, wanting to intimidate. Secondly, he seeks worship. Actually, what this Philistine giant wants to do is subjugate his enemies. He says, if you win, then we'll come and worship you, or we'll come and serve you. But if I win, you will serve us. And again, that's an agenda of the enemy of our souls. In times of pressure, he is seeking worship. He's seeking allegiance to him. And what we find actually in those times of difficulty, that there's often a particular pressure to cling on to things for support and strength. And those very things turn out to be our undoing. So we might cling on to something like anger, because anger helps us fight our cause. But before too long, we find that anger becomes our master and we're its slave. And that this little story in the Old Testament gives us insight into the way that the enemy of our souls works. He works like that. But for David, he stands and fights because he's not sought support in the wrong places. He sought it in his relationship with God. He also, finally, he didn't really understand David's strength at all. He looked at him and he saw this young person with no apparent resources, just this little stone sling, and he doesn't understand him at all. And because he doesn't understand him, David's stone gets under his radar and kills him. And we need to know that actually, for those who have given their lives to Jesus and are people who are following Jesus, who are filled with his Holy Spirit, the Bible actually says that we're hidden in Christ. And there is a sense in which in the spiritual battles we have this kind of invisibility to the enemy. And we have a kind of under the radar ability to strike at him in a way that he doesn't understand, because he doesn't understand love, and he doesn't really understand courage. He doesn't understand trust, and he doesn't understand faith. And for those of us who, if we are growing in love and trust and faith, we will find ourselves with weapons that he doesn't understand, that can slay the enemy. And that's how we become giant slayers. There was a time when Jesus had an interaction with somebody in the synagogue where he was coming in to preach, and somebody suddenly shouts out, "What have you got to do with us?" He says, "I know what you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth. Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And what has happened actually is that the presence of Jesus has exposed the darkness in a person, and a demonic voice speaks out and says, "I know who you are." Jesus is just walking into the synagogue, coming to preach one day. But the presence of Jesus, the presence of his goodness, the pressure of who he is and his kingdom that he carries, exposes the darkness. And involuntarily, this man shouts out. And I think we're called to be like that. People of presence, wherever we are, who carry the sense of the goodness and the power of Jesus as we trust in him, so that we just displace the darkness just by being. That's part of our warfare. Your confidence when other people are afraid. Your purity when everybody else doesn't care. Your love when there's hate. Your faith when everybody else is afraid. Those are your weapons of warfare. And we're called to win. And faith, finally, we look at the person of David. Faith trusts and steps out and is not intimidated. And, you know, it is easy to be intimidated, isn't it? When you look at what is going on in the world at the moment. It's easy to lose hope and to be intimidated. And it's actually easy to be intimidated in our personal circumstances, or just bowed down into despair and hopelessness when things are happening around us that they feel like they're just too hopeless. It's easy to do that. But actually, faith calls out something from each one of us. And God is calling you and I to a position of faith higher now than you were this morning and tomorrow. He calls us to grow in faith. And people who grow in faith step out and they're not intimidated. And actually, David, what he says to this giant, he says, you who come to me with all your shouts and taunts, but I come in the name of the Lord. And it's as if David carries his own culture with him. It's come into the room, it's come into the battlefield with him, this culture of authority, knowing who God is, the name of the Lord, knowing that his authority will work in this situation. Can you grow in confidence in the authority that you've got? Do you understand the power of the name of Jesus and what has been given you as a child of God? You've been moved into the family of God, and the family likeness is authority, confidence, and power. Goliath is a giant in the natural realm, but actually David is a giant in the spiritual realm. And that's what we're called to be. I came across this great little quote from Smith Wigglesworth. Do you know who he is? He was the plumber preacher from the 1800s who saw a lot of healing come from his ministry. But he said this, he said, "I clearly see that we ought to have spiritual giants on the earth, mighty in understanding, amazing in activity, and having wonderful testimonies because of their faith-filled activity. But instead, I see people who are just a little bit more discerning than the others and a little bit more knowledgeable." It's a little bit of a kind of damning indictment, isn't it, of the state of the church maybe in his day. But what Smith Wigglesworth was calling out from the people around him was this faith to be giants who kill and slay the enemy. So just to finish, faith positions us for more. So when we win battles through faith, through seeing the resources, through trusting God and through knowing our authority, it actually positions us for more. The very end of this story is where Saul actually says to his assistant, "Who is that man?" He doesn't even know who David is. He's a little bit switched off and oblivious. But he asks who he is, and he says, "Bring him to me." And you kind of know that the story is going to go on from there, because we know that eventually David becomes the greatest king that Israel ever had. And, you know, winning that battle that day brought him to the attention of Saul. And we see that more is going to come from David's life. And that's what God is saying to us today. That in the places of pressure where you and I need a breakthrough, if we are in places where the darkness is palpable and present, if we're maybe in jobs or in ministries where we're pushing against the powers of darkness, then faith will position us for more. And God's promise for us is that he will be with us, he will never leave us, that Jesus has promised us victory after victory. And that with the eyes of faith, we can see that we're positioned for breakthrough, we're positioned for more. So I just want to leave you with that thought. Where do you need a breakthrough? It may be personally, it may be in ministry, it may be that you've got a longing in your heart to see the powers of darkness gone from an area of life, or politically, or somewhere out there you've been given this longing, and actually God is saying to you, I'm calling you to be a minister of healing and grace in that area, and what I'm giving you is the resources to be at peace, to be powerful, to know your authority, and to win battle after battle so that the kingdom is dispelled. And just finishing with this little quote from Chris Valentin. We can't be satisfied with illustrative sermons, I like those, great music and friendly services. We have been called to see the powers of darkness destroyed and our ruined cities restored. And we're all co-opted into God's army to see the kingdom of love and peace and joy break out here in our city. Have we got faith for that?